Hello, all you movie lovers out there, and welcome to all the movies I've watched so far this year. My name is Fletcher. There is no episode of Undeclared Bajor this week as my co host Data is on vacation in Australia and I hope having a great time. So, to fill in the gap, I thought I'd try something a little different and give a quick review of all the movies I've watched so far this year. None of these are going to be recent movies. They're all from the 70s and 80s, which I have lately been realizing was a great era for movies. I'm not a cinephile or film nerd by any stretch of the imagination, but I do enjoy a good movie. And I love the experience of discovering great movies I've never seen before, and that's kind of been my quest this last couple of months. There are so many great films from the time just before I came of movie-going age, especially R-rated movie-going age, that I still have not seen, and so I've been, with mostly pleasant results, trying to fill in those gaps. I've also been reading the Quentin Tarantino book, Cinema Speculation, which I've been loving, and I thank my brother for giving it to me for Christmas. It's kind of an exploration of American cinema in the 70s, and every single page references like 20 movies I've never heard of. So I think I'm going to be in 70s movie mode for a while as I explore my way through those. Although most of the films on this list I actually watched before I started reading the book. It just kind of happily syncs up with what I've been doing. All the movies on this list are ones that I've seen since the beginning of this year, 2024, and watched for the first time. In that time, I have also rewatched some old favorites, usually in the background while I'm working on something else, but I'm not going to include those just to keep the list short because I don't want to waste time or energy writing reviews of stuff I've seen a million times. Also, the movies discussed are listed in the order I watched them as best as I could remember, with two exceptions, which we'll get to in a second. Also, I'll be giving ratings in my own personal 4-point rating scale, which goes from worst to best, double negative, negative, positive, and double positive. I personally find no point in giving more detailed ratings than that because I find that the experience of watching a movie can change a lot between viewings, but usually stays pretty consistent, at least if I like it or not. Plus, I think it's kind of a sickness in society that we're constantly trying to rate and evaluate everything, especially art. And it would kill me a little bit if I felt like I had to scrutinize every movie to try to figure out if it was like a 6.7 or 6.8 or whatever. I like to watch movies for enjoyment, and these ratings are basically a no-effort report of my feelings based on one viewing. But of course, if you're a fan of Undeclared Bajor, you already know we have a pretty laid-back approach to ratings, so expect pretty much the same thing here. Now, before we get to the main list of movies, I want to quickly touch on a couple of special mentions. Weirdly, the only two recent, as in made within the last year, movies I've watched are the two that I'm not going to rate. The first of these is The Greatest Night in Pop from this year, 2024. I include this year because as a feature-length documentary, I guess technically it is a movie, and I did watch it. It's a pretty straightforward telling of the making of We Are the World, with Lionel Richie, Bruce Springsteen, and other participants telling lots of amusing anecdotes, backed up with behind-the-scenes footage captured, I presume, by the film crew that made the music video. The documentary is strictly focused on its subject matter, with absolutely no diversions or tangents, no talk of what might have been going on in certain people's private lives at the time. No information at all about the actual famine in Ethiopia that inspired the song or how it eventually turned out. Because of its exactly what you expect nature, there's not really much of a point in giving this movie a rating. If you're really into the music scene of the 80s, which I'm not especially, then there should be plenty to hold your interest. Otherwise, I'd say it's a good enough watch if you're, say, home alone and bored some afternoon. I'm also not going to give a rating to 2023's Society of the Snow, or La Sociedad de la Nieve, for a different reason. This is the story of the famous Uruguayan rugby team that crashed in the Andes Mountains in the 70s, probably best known from the 1993 film Alive, but this time told in Spanish with an all South American cast. It's a very well-made movie, but I feel uncomfortable about this true story where some people had to make some very disturbing choices to survive being made into a Hollywood-style movie for all us slack-jawed yokels to gawk at. I think the subject matter is best explored either as a documentary, where the survivors can tell their story in their own voices, or through a totally fictional movie where the morality can be examined more frankly without having to invite judgment on the impossible to judge actions of these real-life individuals. So, with those two out of the way, let's dive into some oldies. The first movie I do want to talk about is actually one that I watched at the end of last year, but it has stuck with me enough that I want to include it on this list. The movie is Sea of Love from 1989, directed by Harold Becker, written by Richard Price, whom the Wire fans may know as the guy who leads the prison book club in a certain tragic episode. It stars Al Pacino, Ellen Barkin, John Goodman, with appearances by Richard Jenkins, Michael Rooker, and a very early appearance by Samuel L. Jackson as, quote, black guy. The story follows Pacino and Goodman investigating a serial killer that they suspect is a woman who targets men who place rhyming personal ads in the newspaper. So to try to catch her, they place their own rhyming personal ad and have Al Pacino go on a dinner date with every single woman who responds, while John Goodman pretends to be the waiter and lifts fingerprints off the women's wine glasses to compare against prints found at one of the crime scenes. At this point, I'll emphasize that this is not a comedy. This premise is played totally straight. Anyway, Pacino winds up falling for one of the women, played by Ellen Barkin, and they start a relationship. But they were never able to get her fingerprints, so Al Pacino may be sleeping with a serial killer. I don't know if I can say this is an especially good movie, or even that I'm comfortable recommending it, but damn it, something intangible about this movie stuck with me, so I'm going to call it a positive. I think it has to do with the writing and the relatable characters and the kind of midlife crisis vibe, which is a theme that we will visit again on this list. Also, the film makes a lot of use of the 1959 pop song Sea of Love by Phil Phillips, and it is a freaking catchy song. There's a really charming scene where Pacino and Goodman sing Sea of Love in a big dining hall full of tough guy cops. In fact, when I was writing this, I had originally thought that the whole hall joins in and sings along, but going back and rewatching, I see that, as so often happens, I had inflated the scene in my imagination, but I still love it. My absolute favorite moment, though, is when Pacino's boss offers to set him up with his sister-in-law and gives him possibly the most crass, yet resonating description of the perfect woman I've ever heard. And I kind of don't want to say it out loud, so let's just listen.
Frankie, you want me to? I'll set you up with my sister-in-law. How's that? She got great tits, divorced, no kids, no cats.
Well, Lou's sister-in-law, she sounds great.
Moving into the new year, the first movie that I actually watched this year was In the Line of Fire from 1993, directed by Wolfgang Peterson, written by Jeff McGuire, starring Clint Eastwood, John Malkovich, and Rene Russo. I didn't really remember that I had watched this movie until I found it in my Netflix watch history, which is definitely not a mark in its favor. It's about an old, washed-up Secret Service agent played by Eastwood who gets sucked into a cat-and-mouse game with John Malkovich, who wants to kill the president, all while Eastwood carries on a thoroughly implausible romance with fellow Secret Service agent Rene Russo. The only thing I kind of interesting about this movie is John Malkovich's villain, but even that's mostly forgettable, so I give this one a negative. Next up is Vigilante from 1982, directed by William Lustig, written by Richard Vetter, starring Robert Forster. I don't really remember much about this movie either. It's kind of a by-the-books, oh no, crime is out of control, one man has been pushed too far, exploitation pick, which is what Tarantino calls a revenge-o-matic. Robert Forster plays a guy whose wife and child are brutally, almost comedically killed by a street gang, and he falls in with a gang of vigilantes after the justice system proves itself to be ludicrously inept/corrupt. Honestly, I don't remember much of the plot, just that at one point Robert Forster goes to jail. and also that the movie frequently seems to forget that the son also got murdered. There's a few exciting scenes of over-the-top violence, but altogether, this is an easy negative for me. Next, we have The Conversation from 1974, which I cannot believe I've never seen before. This movie is so my jam. It's written and directed by Francis Ford Coppola, stars Gene Hackman, featuring a young Harrison Ford, and the legendary John Cazale, famous for being in only 5 movies his whole career, with all 5 of them getting nominated for Best Picture. That's a little pub trivia fact to file away. This is the first Gene Hackman movie on this list, and if I liked Gene Hackman before, I absolutely love him now. Not only because he's a great actor, but he picks really great parts. In this one, he's a surveillance expert hired to keep tabs on a young man and woman who avoid being spied on by having their conversations while walking around in a public plaza. But they're no match for Hackman, who expertly fills the plaza with hidden microphones and painstakingly reconstructs their conversation by mixing together all the different audio sources. And the scene where he does this is so beautiful. It's like 70s techno porn, for lack of a better phrase. And we'll see that's kind of another recurring motif on this list of movies. Anyway, I was so sucked into the world of this character, his paranoia of surveillance that makes him unable to trust anything or anybody in his life, his guilt over a past job that went wrong, and his horror that it might happen again. There's lots of twists and turns, suspense, the direction is amazing, and it just pushes a lot of my buttons. I love stories about surveillance and counter-surveillance. I love spy games. I love stories about characters who get so swept up in being good at what they do and then realizing too late that they actually have a conscience. Despite all the gushing I just did, I'm going to give this one just a single positive for now. Just because even a month later, I don't think I'm done kind of processing this movie. It's definitely on my rewatch list, and I have a strong feeling it will go up to a double positive on my second viewing. Also from 1974, The Parallax View, directed by Alan J. Pakula, written by David Geiler and Lorenzo Simple Jr., starring Warren Beatty. This film is based on a book by Lauren Singer, which was written when the JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King assassinations were still fresh in the national memory. And there was general distrust of the official explanation that all these killings were perpetrated by lone nut jobs who acted all by themselves. So Warren Beatty stars as an investigative journalist who witnesses an RFK-esque assassination of a popular presidential candidate on top of the Space Needle, and then a Warren Commission type panel convenes and finds that the killing was done by, you guessed it, a single nutjob shooter. Beatty doesn't question it at first. After all, he was right there when it happened, but years later, the suspicious death of a fellow reporter inspires him to start digging, and this launches us into a pretty fun, winding, convoluted conspiracy investigation plot, which never gets too complicated to follow. And there are plenty of memorable scenes, notably the dam scene and the whole plane sequence. It has a twist ending that if it was done today, I would write off as way too hokey, but for this movie it works. Overall, Parallax View is about on par with the other 70s conspiracy thrillers I've seen. The story is entertaining enough. Beatty brings a good dose of charisma. I don't think I'll be buying it on Blu-ray anytime soon, but it's still a pretty easy positive. The next movie on the list is Thief from 1981, written and directed by Michael Mann, based, according to Wikipedia, on the memoirs of a real-life thief named Frank Hoemer, although I'm guessing the movie is mostly fictional. In the Quentin Tarantino book, he mentions that the plot of this movie, where a master thief gets betrayed by the mob and has to go on like a revenge spree, strongly resembles the storyline of the Parker novels written by Donald Westlake, which have been adapted into numerous movies over the decades, and I kind of want to do a marathon of all those someday. Anyway, Thief stars James Caan as the thief, and Tuesday Weld as his lady, with notable appearances by Willie Nelson and Jim Belushi. This is another one it's kind of weird I've never seen before, given how much I like Michael Mann, especially Heat. And Thief is a pretty good flick. It's got tons of great style. It's always it's always great to watch a beautiful movie. In fact, I can't find proof of this right now, but I've heard that this is the movie that's credited with inventing the technique of hosing everything down right before the camera rolls to give all the scenes that beautiful just stopped raining look. The burglary scenes are amazing. In fact, the highlight of the movie, brilliantly showing off the impressive technical skill that goes into being a master thief. And with this, the commitment to realism really stands out and sets the movie apart from cliche heist movies where there's one guy with a laptop hacking his way into the security system or a guy listening in a safe with a stethoscope or something. And again, midlife crisis. James Caan has spent too much of his young years in prison, and now he's got to catch up. He doesn't have time to build a career or a family the traditional way. He's got to grab what he can when he can get it. Solid positive on this one, with maybe room to bump up to a double positive on repeat viewings. My main complaint is that the big bloody action scene at the end just feels a little ho-hum. It doesn't have the thrill or the bite of Robert De Niro's hunt for Waingro at the end of Heat. In fact, there's a lot of little things from this movie, like character moments, plot elements, that are refined and perfected in Heat. I'd almost say that Thief and Heat would make a great double feature, but such a viewing would take 5 hours and might be difficult to sit through. So what's a good follow-up for Thief? How about Cop from 1988? Written and directed by James B. Harris, based on a novel by James Ellroy, and starring James Woods. So it's just Jameses all over the place. I've been a fan of James Ellroy's Underworld USA trilogy for a long time, and lately I worked my way through his LA Quartet, which is the series that includes The Black Dahlia and LA Confidential, which have both been made into pretty well-known movie adaptations. But James Ellroy has written many books, and some of the lesser-known ones also have been adapted into movies. Example? Cop, based on Blood of the Moon, the first of the Lloyd Hopkins trilogy, which I have not read. But this movie is unmistakably Ellroy. All the tropes are in full effect. The depiction of the LAPD, cops doing warrantless B&Es as a matter of routine, cops reading through big stacks of files trying to find a needle in a haystack, forensic procedure, everybody bugging everybody, then people finding other people's bugs of other people, and then secretly listening to their tapes, and then finding out that they were also getting bugged so that they could be blackmailed. And then there's the characters. As for the women characters, I'll just say that they all have that Ellroy women feel. And, for example, there's also a gay, super corrupt sheriff's deputy who is an unmistakable Ellroy creation. And James Woods. The only moment where he's truly likable in this movie is the scene where he entertains his young daughter with way too grown-up stories of catching criminals, and then she's getting totally into it. The rest of the time, he's a sleazy, womanizing asshole. There are some entertaining moments, like when James Woods shoots a burglary suspect, then he takes the dead guy's girlfriend, who is totally not disturbed by any of this, and goes off somewhere with her, presumably to bang. Or the part where James Woods is at the feminist poetry lady's house, and he's just squirming, trying to be polite, listening to all her boring talk, so that he can maybe eventually get into her pants. The movie ends with a pretty lame showdown with a serial killer in a high school gym. It was an interesting watch for the Ellroy-ness of it, but I did not like this movie, and I give it a negative. Next, we dive back into Michael Mann with Manhunter from 1986, written and directed by him, and starring William Peterson and Tom Noonan. Another movie I can't believe I've never seen, and in fact, before I started watching, I thought I had seen at least part of it, but it quickly became clear to me that the whole thing was pretty much brand new to me. It's based on the novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, and I'm going to say right now that I reject the conventional wisdom among snooty internet movie nerds that Manhunter is a better movie than Red Dragon, or the Red Dragon movie directed by Brett Ratner, which I've seen many times. I'm definitely not saying it's a worse film than the Brett Ratner one, but the updated version has Edward Norton, Ralph Fiennes, and Philip Seymour Hoffman, and all that shit adds up. Although, crazily, I don't think Anthony Hopkins is necessarily an improvement over Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter in this story. His performance in Silence of the Lambs is, of course, unequaled. I guess before things get too confusing, I'll clarify that this is the first movie and book in the Hannibal Lecter universe. You know, the suave, flesh-eating serial killer who occasionally helps the FBI solve crimes. If you're not already familiar with this franchise, then I don't know how else to explain it. This is actually also the first of 3 adaptations of this book, since I understand that the Hannibal TV series did the Red Dragon story in its final season, although I only made it through the first few episodes of that last season, and I never got to the Red Dragon stuff. So I can't currently make any comparisons to that, except to say that Hugh Dancy is by far my favorite Will Graham. But since I've seen the Ratner version so many times, and since the scripts for Manhunter and Red Dragon are like scene for scene, almost line for line identical with the exception of the ending, it made for a really interesting movie watching experience where pretty much every little line and moment I was judging which movie did it better. And if I start listing all those little things and comparing, I will be here for another hour. So let's just say it was about a tie game as far as those little things go, and leave it at that. The aspect in which Manhunter clearly excels is, no surprise, the style. Nobody can 80s like Michael Mann. Although I would still say it's one of his weakest in terms of style. Far superior, however, to the Brett Ratner version, which was kind of bland, kind of like a bland attempt to recreate the look and feel of Silence of the Lambs. The weakness of Manhunter is the 2 main performances. William Peterson as Will Graham and Tom Noonan as Francis Dollarhide. Both of them felt really goofy, especially Peterson, who kept having these weird, over-the-top emotional outbursts that just kept taking me right out of the scene. The final point of comparison is the ending. The remake and apparently the book end with an elaborate fake-out where Dollarhide fakes his death and then goes and attacks Will Graham and his family at his home. This, for a movie, is too much, and Manhunter smartly ends the movie at the big showdown at Dollarhide's house and just has Graham shoot Dollarhide, and that's the end of it. However, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida was not the correct choice for the soundtrack in this scene, and Graham's slow-mo jump through the window is ridiculous in a way that normally I would love, but in this movie just annoys me. So a lot of that review was just comparison, but I believe that if Brett Ratner's Red Dragon did not exist, Manhunter would be nowhere near as beloved, or pretended to be beloved, as it is now. I do give it a positive. It's a fine little gem of a movie, but we're talking like a semi-precious gem, like an amethyst, not like a full-on diamond. Well, I say that, but then it's time to talk about Gleaming the Cube from 1989. Directed by Graham Clifford, written by Michael Tolkien, not to be confused with the Tolkien family. Starring a young Christian Slater with notable appearances by Stephen Bauer and Tony Hawk. And apparently, according to Wikipedia, Yo Gabba Gabba creator Christian Jacobs. And no, that's not DJ Lance Rock, it's a different guy. Slater plays a teenage skateboard punk whose adopted Vietnamese American brother discovers a conspiracy to smuggle illegal weapons to an anti-communist rebel faction in Vietnam, and winds up getting murdered with a wet towel in a seedy motel, which for some reason is right next to Disneyland. The cops are clueless, and it's up to Slater to avenge his brother the only way he knows how, on 4 wheels. If you're pumped, as I was for that premise, prepare to be bitterly disappointed. This movie is case in point for the truism that an idea is nothing and execution is everything. The title comes supposedly from skateboard slang and is never adequately explained in the movie except that it refers to some kind of skateboarder nirvana or something. The story is boring and aimless and focuses heavily on Slater going through some kind of identity crisis. Along the way, the film makes many bizarre and nonsensical choices that are often unintentionally comedic. I dare you not to laugh your ass off when Christian Slater makes a big Manhunter-esque leap through a plate glass window to rescue his love interest, only to get immediately knocked unconscious by the fall, giving the bad guy the chance to just shoot the girl's dad and escape. The fun moments come mostly at the end, including the grand Pizza Hut truck coming over the horizon shot, but by then it's way too late. Objectively, I would give this a negative, but for squandering so much potential, I punish it with a double negative, which I clarify does not cancel out and make a positive. This brings us to, I think, 2 weekends ago when I decided to sit down and do a triple feature of movies directed by David Cronenberg. I've seen some movies directed by Cronenberg, but not any of his major ones from the 80s. So I started off with widely beloved classic Scanners from 1981, starring Stephen Lack, Jennifer O'Neill, Number 6 himself, Patrick McGoohan, and Michael Ironside. Stephen Lack plays a hobo with psychic powers who gets recruited into kind of an underground war of scanners, people who have dangerous mental abilities. And yes, I have seen the famous head exploding scene many times before, and I have to say that in the context of the movie, it's pretty underwhelming. Plus, just like the head explosion in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which came out the same year, apparently, it's so obviously a prop that it takes me right out of it. The best parts of the movie are the world building, the scanner underworld with its various competing factions, the corporate conspiracies, and of course the sci-fi concepts are really cool. I don't know quite how I feel about the revelation that scanners can also read the minds of computers, but at least it's something you don't see all the time. And the ending, I think, was like perfect. It all adds up to a pretty decent sci-fi flick, and importantly, fresh and unique even to a viewer in the 2020s, so it's a pretty solid positive. Scanners I followed up with Videodrome from 1983, starring James Woods and Debbie Harry of Blondie. Pretty much everything I liked about Scanners, I loved about Videodrome. James Woods is perfectly cast as the sleazeball TV executive sucked into a conspiracy of a video transmitted mind virus. Everything about this film is just so original and bold and grand and weird. It's exactly my kind of movie. The special effects are amazing, and there's just one beautiful, grotesque visual after another. I love that neither we, the audience, nor James Woods ever fully understand what's going on, which in a lot of movies would piss me off, but it's perfect for this story. It's paced out just right, where right as we think we're getting a handle on things, something new and weird happens, or we get some new information, and we're suddenly a big step back. We're always trying to puzzle out like who's on what side, what even are the sides, what are everybody's true goals, and we never figure it out, and we don't really care, because as the movie goes on, those questions become less and less important to our, quote, hero, James Woods. Right up to the big ending where we're left scratching our heads, why did that happen, and who did it serve, and was it even a bad thing or a good thing for James Woods? The metaphor of the Videodrome virus for the pervasive, sinister influence of mass media on the Western psyche works so well because it resonates with, rather than preaching about, the state of modern society. It doesn't pretend to have solutions or do any finger wagging. It just kind of taps into that collective anxiety. I guess what I'm saying is that Videodrome is better than every Black Mirror episode put together. I give it a double positive, and I will also say that Scanners and Videodrome make a hell of a double feature. But I took it even further than that and continued on to The Dead Zone, which was originally released the same year as Videodrome. This one has a screenplay by Jeffrey Boehm based on the novel by Stephen King, and the Kingness is apparent in this movie. It stars young, dare I say baby-faced, Christopher Walken as a high school English teacher, of course, who goes into a coma for 5 years and wakes up with psychic abilities. It also features Brooke Adams, Tom Skerritt, Martin Sheen, and supposedly the cigarette-smoking man himself, William B. Davis, as an ambulance driver, but as hard as I looked and scanned back through the movie, I could not find him. So if anybody knows where he is, maybe you can give me a timestamp. This has a very different feel from the other two Cronenbergs on this list. It definitely leans more heavily in the Stephen King direction. Super wholesome characters like Christopher Walken, his tragic love interest, Brooke Adams, and Tom Skerritt's sheriff facing off against dark supernatural forces. Martin Sheen plays a Senate candidate who we learn is destined to get elected president and start World War III if he wins this election. And like so many of King's villains, it's not really clear if he's just a really messed up guy or if he's being warped by some unseen supernatural evil. For a lot of the movie, it's not clear, in a way I'm not saying is necessarily bad or good, what the ultimate point of the plot is supposed to be. Walken gets these powers, standard psychic stuff. He can touch people and objects and have visions of their past, present, or future, which at first he uses to save a little girl from a house fire. But then he shies away from his powers until Tom Skerritt comes and asks him to help find a serial killer. So I'm like, okay, now this is the main plot. Psychic everyman Christopher Walken using his powers to hunt down a serial killer and face down true evil. But he catches the killer almost immediately. But he laments that when he was having a vision of the killer's last murder, it was like he was in the scene, but all he did was stand there and watch. So then I'm thinking, oh, are they hinting that maybe he can use his visions to actually change what happens in the past? That could go all kinds of cool directions. But no, that's never brought up again. Instead, we get a couple more mini stories, like the serial killer one. The first about Walken befriending a young tutoring student and then having to save him against the boy's father's obstinacy from an ice skating accident. And then the final act where Walken realizes that to save the world from nuclear annihilation, he's going to have to go full Lee Harvey Oswald on Martin Sheen. And that whole thing, including the delightfully bonkers moment with the baby, was my favorite part of the movie. Anyway, it's a movie that feels a lot more like a novel, and it clearly knows its strengths, particularly the lead performance by Christopher Walken. Like I said, it's a change of pace from the first two Cronenbergs, but it's definitely a positive. As King adaptations go, I'd say it's near the top of that very long list. From the Cronenbergs, I went back to my 70s thriller viewings with 1976's Marathon Man, which I think I might actually have started before the Cronenbergs. I don't remember. I definitely watched it in 2 sessions. Marathon Man, not to be confused with Running Man, which is a very different movie, was directed by John Schlesinger, with a screenplay by the author of the novel, William Goldman, who also wrote the novel and screenplay for The Princess Bride. I never would have guessed in a million years that those 2 movies were by the same guy. The movie stars Dustin Hoffman and features Laurence Olivier, Roy Scheider, William Devane, and Martha Killer. Hoffman plays a history grad student and aspiring marathon runner who stumbles into some kind of Nazi diamond smuggling operation. I actually kind of lost track of what the deal with the diamonds was. Like at the beginning of the movie, they smuggle the diamonds to France, but then a guy gets bombed and another guy gets his throat slit, and later the diamonds are right back in New York somehow. I guess the diamonds at the end are different extra diamonds, which also happen to be held in a Band-Aid box. I don't know. And also, I now realize the homage in Better Call Saul of keeping diamonds in a Band-Aid box. And also, I really don't understand how Dustin Hoffman's girlfriend is supposed to fit into the whole thing. But it's okay, because I'm pretty sure Dustin Hoffman's character doesn't understand any of it either. He knows exactly what he needs to know, which is that there's some kind of bullshit going on with Nazis and diamonds, and he needs to get away from it. If there's one reason to watch this movie, it's Dustin Hoffman. His performance is just amazing, compelling, charismatic, relatable. And there are a bunch of great scenes, especially in the last half of the movie. The dental torture scene, the escape scene where Hoffman calls on his marathon training to outrun the Nazis, the scene where Hoffman hires some guys to rob his apartment. I was almost cheering at the burglar's great line, "That ain't the catch, that's the fun." That guy was played by actor Tito Goya, to give some much-deserved credit. The scene where Nazi war criminal Laurence Olivier goes to New York's Jewish diamond district to ask about the value of his diamonds and slowly starts to be recognized by more and more of his former victims who now inhabit that neighborhood. It's beautiful. And the big finale where Hoffman squares off with Olivier in the water treatment plant, and he just has no clue what to do, so in a fit of near madness, he just tells Laurence Olivier to eat the diamonds. I mean, just loved it. So I'm going to give this movie a double positive based on Hoffman's performance, the fire hose of great scenes in the last half of the movie. But the thing is, I just don't know if it's a movie that's going to go into my library anytime soon. So if there is ever a movie that makes a case for a finer-grained rating system than the one I'm using, this is it. Following my Cronenberg triple feature, I did a Brian De Palma triple feature, beginning with Dressed to Kill from 1980. Directed and written by De Palma, starring Angie Dickinson, Michael Caine, Nancy Allen, Keith Gordon, and featuring a young-ish Dennis Franz. This movie started off on my bad side with its super gratuitous shower dream scene, but then began to win me over when it got to the dialogueless museum sequence where Angie Dickinson plays a little cat and mouse game with a handsome stranger, which would make a fun little short film in its own right. There were enough twists and turns and interesting characters to hold my interest all the way through. I loved Nancy Allen as the spunky stock investing escort, and Keith Gordon as the nerdy teen who tries using his nerd skills to solve his mother's murder. But every time I saw the killer, I was like, is that Michael Caine in a wig? And yes, it was. I'll go ahead and spoil that right now. Knowing that information ahead of time can only spare you lots of annoyance. In fact, Michael Caine in the film's not very delicate handling of transsexual issues are definitely the weakest aspect of the movie, although I admit the scene where Nancy Allen and Keith Gordon have dinner at the top of the World Trade Center, and she explains to him the details of male-to-female surgery while an old lady looks on shocked and scandalized in the background, has so many layers of weirdness to a 2024 viewer that I kind of loved it. There was a lot of sleazy stuff, which I don't necessarily mind. I mean, I'll watch Nancy Allen take a shower. You don't have to twist my arm. But there were plenty of ridiculous moments, especially towards the end, when I was sure I was not going to wind up liking this movie. But once we did get that one last jump and the credits started rolling, I had to admit, I enjoyed the movie, so I give it a positive. I don't think I'll ever go out and rewatch it by myself, but if someone ever says, hey, we're gonna watch Dress to Kill, wanna watch? I'd say, yeah, sure. The next De Palma is Blowout from 1981, starring John Travolta, Nancy Allen, again, John Lithgow, and again featuring Dennis Franz. This is the story of a movie sound effects specialist who witnesses a fatal Chappaquiddick-esque car accident involving a presidential candidate and comes to believe that what happened was actually an assassination. Along for the ride is Nancy Allen, who was in the car and knows just a little too much for her own good. I really enjoyed this movie, starting right at the beginning with, again, the super gratuitous sorority slasher fake out. The very best stuff was the audio recording and audio reconstruction scenes, which had this great editing, and again, it's just more of that kind of like analog techno porn or whatever. I thought John Travolta and Nancy Allen were both great. I really enjoyed watching Dennis Franz turn the sleaze factor up to 10. The only character I'm a little iffy on is the one played by John Lithgow, but that has nothing to do with his performance and is more to do with the way the character is written. He's basically the stone-cold, psychotic fixer for the shadowy politicians who's going around covering up the murder. The guy's clearly got skills, but I always got the sense that he had a couple of screws loose, and to me that made him not so scary, even though we did see him stab a lady to death with an ice pick pretty early in the movie. But the whole time I was confident that when it came down to it, Travolta would have no trouble outsmarting this guy. But of course, given what happens at the end, that was obviously a miscalculation on my part. And that ending definitely took me by surprise. After a while, I kind of settled into the movie and started to form an idea of how it was going to turn out. I mean, John Travolta is just so confident and capable, I thought he couldn't lose. But that part at the end, and that final scene where he's finally gotten his perfect scream, and I was just like, no, that's not right. But then, of course, after I had time to digest it for a while, I realized I kind of love it. So Blowout gets a double positive from me. I could talk for maybe another hour about all the stuff I loved about it. But we have to move on to the last De Palma on the list, Body Double from 1984. Directed by De Palma, written by De Palma and Robert Averick, starring Craig Wasson, Melanie Griffith, Greg Henry, Deborah Shelton, and look, there's Dennis Franz again. With this one, we're back to the not-so-subtle Hitchcock inspirations. I'm definitely not the first person to observe that Dress to Kill is basically De Palma's version of Psycho, and Body Double is his extra pervy version of Rear Window, with some vertigo thrown in. And a big problem I had with Body Double is the same problem I had with Dress to Kill, which is that I can tell who the killer is as soon as I look at him. You're not fooling me, movie. I'm onto you. Especially if you tried pretty much the same disguise trick in Dress to Kill. But there's a lot in this movie that is great, starting with the star, Craig Wasson, who I've never seen in anything else, but he's just perfect for this role of the kind of sweet, naive, and pervy struggling actor who gets duped into being a pawn in this really stupidly elaborate murder plot. Just like in Blowout, there are a lot of scenes that are technically dazzling, and Dressed to Kill also. But yeah, brilliantly staged, shot and edited scenes, starting with the peeping Tom scenes where, there's this complicated geography. Our hero is up on the hill spying on the lady in the house, and then also seeing the supposedly Indian guy on the cell tower, whatever that was, also spying into the house. It's just flawlessly and beautifully executed. And also I want to point out that UFO house with its panoramic view of LA is just a freaking great location visually. Although I'm sure that the interiors were probably a set. They still look so cool. Other dazzlingly crafted scenes were the shopping center sequence and the beach condo sequence, which are just masterful. Like, I loved and really resonated with the whole just persistent perviness of the whole movie. And I love the depiction that the porn industry is portrayed like just a business filled with normalish people trying to make a living. Usually, I think it's stuff like Boogie Nights where, it's filled with all these weirdos and, it's this really kind of gross, sleazy business. Kind of the most normal part of the movie was the porn scenes. The weakest part of the movie for me was the third act, which just kind of goes into some standard thriller suspense stuff. Especially the part on the blocked off road when the suspense mainly comes from the mind-boggling incompetence of the police. And then the part after that where Craig Wasson is about to be buried alive and suddenly flashes back to the beginning of the movie and stands up to Dennis Franz, like in his imagination. It was kind of good, but it felt a little wonky to me. The part I did love was the very end, which kind of felt like Brian De Palma saying, "Oh, you didn't like the ending of Blowout? Here, most absurdly, surreally happy ending possible. You like that better, huh?" It almost makes you wonder if Craig Wasson just had some kind of psychotic break or something right there at the end. So I give Body Double a strong positive. I think if I was going to watch it again, I might do it as the first half of a double feature with Blowout, even though this movie came later. But I think that order would just work better. Second to last movie on this list is The French Connection from 1971, directed by William Friedkin, screenplay by Ernest Tidyman, starring Gene Hackman. I really don't have much to say about this one because I really don't think I gave it a proper viewing. This is one that I started and paused. I didn't come back to until a few days later, and I kind of lost track of a few of the plot points. Like, what's with the whole sniper scene? Was the sniper trying to kill Gene Hackman? I don't know. Quentin Tarantino talks about The French Connection in his book, where he says that as a kid, he really didn't understand what was going on beyond some vague understanding that Gene Hackman was just trying to get Gene Hackman was trying to get the French guy with the beard. And that kind of fits with my experience in this first viewing. But in broad strokes, I liked it. It's really well made. There's lots of cool scenes. All the cop stuff felt really realistic. And I like the way it spotlighted a lot of the less warm and fuzzy aspects of police work. Oh, and Gene Hackman was great, of course. So I'll throw it a positive. And that brings us to the last movie on today's list, and the one I've watched most recently, which is 1975's Night Moves, directed by Arthur Penn, written by Alan Sharp, starring Gene Hackman, Jennifer Warren, a very young, in fact, uncomfortably young Melanie Griffith, and that's definitely intentional on the part of the movie, and a young James Woods. The film is not affiliated with the Bob Seger song of the same name, and also I confess I don't understand what the title refers to in either the song or the movie. I don't know, is that some 70s slang or what? I'd never heard of this movie. I just kind of randomly saw it in the, you may also like section of Just Watch or Amazon or one of those websites. It turned out to be probably the most challenging movie I've seen recently. And I'm still not exactly sure if that's in a good or a bad way, but I think good. It's been almost a week now since I watched it, and I'm still kind of digesting it. Gene Hackman is a private eye who finds out his wife is cheating on him with Harris Yulin, who Deep Space Nine fans might recognize as Eamon Maritza, the Cardassian prisoner from the classic episode duet. But Gene Hackman takes a job of tracking down a runaway teenage girl who's played by Melanie Griffith. This movie makes a very clear effort to avoid private eye tropes. Instead of being a boozing, cynical, jaded, wisecracking, womanizing stereotype, Gene Hackman is actually a really likable guy, like really good-natured, with a pretty good marriage except for the cheating part. And this movie also takes a pretty clear stance, mostly voiced through Gene Hackman's wife, that Private Eye is kind of a dumb and sleazy job. I mean, they don't really ever solve anything, they just kind of dig up dirt and mess up people's lives. And of the midlife crises we've seen on this list, this is perhaps the midlife crisisiest. Hackman is clearly having mixed feelings about his job, in this ongoing sense of, what am I doing with my life? Which at this age I can definitely relate to. When the teenage Melanie Griffith flirtingly asks him his age, Gene Hackman says, I'm 40, in this really relatable way, like he can't believe he's hearing himself say it. And of course, to a young girl, that probably sounds like he's 100. Throughout the movie, Hackman studies this old chess game, which I think is a reference to, I want to say, Raymond Chandler's character Marlowe. One of those old hard-boiled private eyes was always studying chess. But Hackman obsesses about this one game where a player had an opportunity for a beautiful 3-move checkmate that he missed and wound up losing the game. And ultimately it does no good because Hackman is constantly missing important clues. At one point he gets an answering machine message from Melanie Griffith where she's clearly about to give him some crucial information, but he gets interrupted in the middle of listening and forgets all about it. And while you're expecting that later he'll suddenly have an aha moment and go back and listen to it, he just never remembers it. The mystery plot is a little hard to follow, but like previous movies that have had this issue that I've discussed, I don't think it's that important. Gene Hackman seems to have a pretty good idea what's going on, but it's really hard to unravel, like, who is doing what, who knows what people's motivations are. So the big scene at the end when the guy in the airplane starts shooting an Uzi at Gene Hackman, I'm like, wait, why is this happening? And the very ending is, in feeling, very similar to Blowout, in that I don't like it, but I can't deny it sticks with you. I think this movie just really touched a nerve with me and where I happen to be in my life right now. There's a lot of it that's just really unsatisfying, but not necessarily, like I've said, in a bad way, and I think that's deliberate. Aside from being the most challenging, I'd also say it's the most interesting and discussable movie on this list. I'm definitely going to have to schedule a rewatch, but for now it gets a positive, which upon rewatch I could easily imagine that rating going up or down. So that's my movies I've seen so far this year. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and hopefully maybe you got some ideas for movies to check out. I'd welcome hearing any of your thoughts in the comments. We will hopefully be back next Monday with the next Undeclared Bajor episode, so until then, be well.